You are listening to She Rises, a podcast dedicated to women who are ready to stop settling and start living their lives by design. If you're ready to talk about the stuff that weighs you down and get practical advice on everything from your health, body image, spirituality, relationships, and personal growth, then you're in the right place. Hello, I'm Giovanna Capozza, your host, master coach, spiritual teacher, and mind-body expert, and I'm on a mission to unsettle women all over the world. Are you ready to rise? Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of She Rises. I'm your host, Giovanna Capozza, and I'm here today talking about something that is near and dear to my heart. Many topics on this show are definitely near and dear to my heart, but this one in particular, because I've struggled with this personally, and I see so many people struggle with this idea that if you are a spiritual seeker, if you are a spiritual being, if your goal or mission in life is to be aligned with your spirit, then somehow being prosperous and abundant is mutually exclusive. And I'm here today to tell you that they are not. In fact, I've brought an expert on the show to teach you exactly how they are not. I hope you guys pick up her book and you love this show as much as I loved it. Ellen Grace Obrian is the author of The Jewel of Abundance, Finding Prosperity Through the Ancient Wisdom of Yoga. She's also the director of the Center for Spiritual Enlightenment in San Jose, California. Ellen is an esteemed yoga teacher, a radio host, and an award-winning poet who weaves poetry into her teachings on spiritual matters, pointing to the mystical experience beyond words and thought. And she's teaching us today how those two concepts of spiritual and abundant are not mutually exclusive, and in fact, they are your divine right. Her book is amazing. I hope you guys pick up a copy, and more so, I hope you love and enjoy this show. And hey, if you know someone who's struggling with this concept, pass this show on to them. I think they'll really get a lot from it and definitely pick up The Jewel of Abundance. Ellen, welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you on She Rises today.
Thank you, Giovanna. It's a delight to be here with you and your listeners.
Absolutely. You know, I was telling you just before we hit record that when I was contacted by your publisher, given a copy of your book, just even reading the title, I was excited already, and I was a hell yes to have you on the show. The book is called The Jewel of Abundance, Finding Prosperity Through the Ancient Wisdom of Yoga. And that was right up my alley, being that I'm a yogi. And like many of us and many of our listeners, we're interested in prosperity. And, you know, a lot of us in the, spiritual world will often do a little bit of a bypass around prosperity and the concept of abundance. And I was so intrigued to have you come on the show and share a little bit about your story and also the wisdom from the book. So welcome again. And
thank you.
Yeah, I would love if you could tell us a little bit about how it is that you got to this concept and the book.
Well, I think you're right in that, so many of us on the spiritual path in life, whatever that path is, we are following our soul yearning to awaken spiritually. And at the same time, we have an innate urge to prosper. It's natural to us, but we don't really know how to connect that, because we've had a lot of, press in from ancient times, even that those two don't go together, that spirituality and prosperity are at odds with one another. But yoga, is about union. It's about body, mind, spirit as one, and it's about living a spiritually conscious life, and in a sense, healing that split. So I was really interested in that. How do we live our whole life? How do we live our full life and not divide it up? Which, at the core, that's what yoga is about. So then, as I began teaching yoga, I noticed that was a real problem for for people. They were still dividing it up, like their spiritual life was, when they meditated or when they went to their spiritual center, but then work life and money and career was something else. And so when you dive into the ancient wisdom of yoga, the ancient scriptures, you actually find in there some powerful guidance about how to live a spiritually conscious, prosperous life. And not only how to do it, but the imperative that we're actually supposed to do it. So it's really exciting.
I love that you brought that in. I remember years back, I read The Science of Getting Rich by Wallace Wattles. And in the book, he says, and I'm paraphrasing, but he basically says, God wants you to be rich. And I was just coming from, I always joke and say I'm a recovering Catholic. I mean, Catholicism has its beauty, and I know that religious dogma has been part of this, training and imprinting about abundance. And when I read that book and I read that sentence that God wants you to be rich, I was like, what? Really? It was such a paradigm shift for me. And the body, mind, spirit, like sometimes we take that so literally, but the body is the material, right? Is the material world, and there is a union there. So I love that you shared that. Beautiful.
Yeah, and I think, learning how to prosper is the key. It was bold of me, sort of radical, really, to write a book about spirituality and prosperity.
Absolutely. That's why I wanted you on.
Yeah, people think, oh, those are they're either not supposed to go together, or people conflate them in a way that is not exactly healthy. That somehow we're supposed to get rich, and that's a mark of our spiritual evolution. But when we look at our worthiness, right? But this is really a much bigger picture about what wealth is. We don't have to look far to see that wealth is not just material goods, that it's our health, it's our relationships, it's our creative energy, all of that is our wealth. But when we look in the yoga tradition, what we find is that wealth is intended to be the instrument for fulfilling your purpose in life. And that's where it gets really juicy. That's where it gets really good.
I love that. Let's just dive right into the juiciness then, shall we?
Sure.
Yeah, let's dive in there. And could you say a little bit more about that?
Well, this goal to prosper in life in the Vedic teachings is part of what is called the Purusharthas. And as a Sanskrit word, you don't have to know that in order to prosper, but it's nice because it means for the sake of the soul. And so there are these 4 universal aims of life that are said to be for the sake of the soul. That means to live a spiritually conscious life where the soul can thrive. And the first goal is to live with higher purpose, dharma, to do what we're here to do, to make our contribution to life. And the second goal is actually wealth, or what is called artha, which means wealth or abundance. And then the third goal, it starts even getting better. The third goal is pleasure, kama. To enjoy life. And can you believe this is a spiritual program? This is so great.
Yes, I love it already.
And then the fourth goal is moksha, or enlightenment, liberation in this lifetime. So the thing about these 4 goals is that they are all tied together. And so that's what I was sort of pointing to in my opening remarks with you, is that wealth is not seen for its own sake. It's seen in harmony with these other goals of life. It's there to serve. It's there to support us being able to fulfill our higher purpose in life, which also has to do with cooperating with the infinite. It's not, we're not looked at as a little, ego, little egos running around. We're looked at as expressions of the infinite, ultimate divine. And we're here to serve that. We're here to, fulfill our greater potential and to contribute to contribute to the greater good. And so, in terms of writing this radical book about prosperity, not only for me was it about healing the split in our individual lives, but also in our world, because this split, the so-called split between the material and the spiritual, I think is behind the way that we see the earth, as material, as resources that we can use rather than as sacred. And that's a problem, and it's one for us to get over. And we have this disparity of wealth in our world that we also want to be looking at it in a higher way. So I have those really big goals with this work.
Yeah, I love those goals. I love how you're, marrying the two together, or remarrying rather, because they've always been married. I love that it's universal principle. It's in the most ancient of wisdom. And I, of course, I always take the stance on this side of the microphone and say, well, what about people that are listening, and what would they say? And I think about, people that are right now maybe currently struggling. They're struggling to actually marry the two, to actually break that dogma within themselves that if I'm spiritual and I'm, doing this inner work and working towards this, then, XYZ, A plus B equals C, right? I can't then also be prosperous and wealthy because there's something ungodly or unspiritual about that. What are some ways that we can start to practically dismantle that thought system within ourselves?
I think the principal thing is understanding the role of wealth, and as I mentioned, to support and serve dharma. Dharma is the foundation for it all. Dharma means support. Dharma means divine order. It means a thing, being what it is, its nature. And so, wealth is meant to be seen as the necessary resources that we gather to express our higher purpose. And that split, in mind that it's not okay to thrive or prosper means that in a way, we're saying to ourselves, I'm not, it's not okay to fulfill my potential, when everything in nature is inclined to fulfill its potential. And for us as human beings, fulfilling that potential is waking up to the spiritual truth of our being and doing what is ours to do in harmony with the infinite. So we're, I call this the prosperity imperative. We are always being nudged to thrive. So we need to learn how to do it. So first is understanding that wealth is to support dharma, is to support living with higher purpose. And then, secondly is really coming to a better understanding of wealth not being limited to simply material goods. I mean, we really know that, but we just kind of forget about it. And so it's understanding that the greatest wealth is really soul wealth. And in the book, I tell stories about people who, I have known who exemplify for me what thriving looks like. And I talk about experiences with two women, Dolores Huerta, who was a co-founder with Cesar Chavez of the farm worker movement in the U.S., and Ela Gandhi and her, the granddaughter of Mahatma Gandhi, and her struggles during the apartheid era in South Africa. Both of those women understood, in a sense, wealth as spiritual resources. So those resources within us, that allow us to do what we're here to do is really our true wealth.
Yeah, I love that. Redefining wealth for yourself, and then what wealth is just as the greater meaning of that. And I love that you connected it to your dharma or your life purpose. And I mean, probably the million, if not $1 billion question that I hear a lot from people who are maybe struggling, whether it's, with wealth, prosperity, or even just feeling a sense of lack of fulfillment in their life, is this idea that I can't find my purpose. I don't know what that is. I'm looking for it. I talked to a lot of women who are seekers, just like I've been and am, and they're always looking for that golden nugget. And I find that sometimes it's closer than we think. And what would you say to someone that's struggling with that question of what is my purpose? What is my dharma?
One of them, that's such a good question, because I know it comes up, and I do talk about this in the book, and used to have an exercise, for looking at that. But I see that the main obstacle is that people are thinking of dharma or life purpose as vocation. And it comes from, a very early age of, sort of what do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to do? And children start thinking about that. Well, I want to be a doctor. I want to be an engineer. I want to be a singer. But really our dharma unfolds from our own nature itself. Within all of us are these divine capacities, divine potentials, for compassion, for creativity. All of these are divine qualities within us. And if we look back, into our childhood, we can see those qualities that were sort of in, seed form, but they were there, so, some children, you can really see that quality of compassion. They're always, supporting little animals, right? Or the creativity, they're performing a magic show, there's these qualities. And so when we look at what our purpose is, I think it's so helpful to understand our purpose as the flowering of these divine capacities. In other words, you're going to become in fullness that which you have always been in potential. And vocation is not your dharma. Vocation is a vehicle for expressing those divine qualities. So, jobs come and jobs go, and they change a lot. And especially in today's economy, people are changing jobs. So you don't want to equate your purpose with your job. You want to understand, purpose as this blossoming of your divine self, really, and those qualities within your own being.
If we were on video right now, you would see the giant smile on my face. I love that you separated those two. And that it isn't about your vocation. It's not, you could be a garbage man or woman. You could be a mail carrier. You could be a professor. It's not related to what you do to earn money in this world, or even what you feel or call as your vocation in this world, but rather that cultivation of those divine, beautiful pieces of yourself. I adore that. I adore that. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, there is the piece where we want our work to be a harmonious vehicle,
right,
for those qualities. So that's part of the search too. We just don't want to think of our purpose as being defined by vocation. We're going to turn it around and understand that our vocation, whatever that is, can be an avenue for expressing that higher purpose. But in and of itself, it's not the higher purpose.
I love that clarification. Having that sort of desire for those two things to be aligned, of course, I think it's what people, especially the women that I work with, when they're craving that, I think that is essentially what the craving is. It's to align those two things. But I think it was so perfect what you said, that often we discount these ways in which, even as very young children in our youth, that those attributes are showing themselves to us. So we're almost looking in the wrong place, but there is that essential desire to sort of marry the two.
Yes, and really, this spiritual path, spiritual life is all about learning how to look in the right place and in the right way. Meaning, developing this skill of what I would call self-referral with a capital S. learning how to access our own innate wisdom. That was one of the questions I had so early on when I came to the spiritual path. I wanted to know how I could know what was true, what was right. How could I more predictably access my own wisdom instead of, always looking outside of myself, looking in a book or looking to a teacher or looking, someplace else to find out, to figure out, what was right for me. I really wanted to know, how can I know that for myself?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. One of the things that struck me, obviously the title of your book, The Jewel of Abundance, but in particular the subtitle, right? Finding Prosperity Through the Ancient Wisdom of Yoga. I thought I had this giant invisible question mark pop up in my head. And there was a part of it that was like, well, yeah, that makes sense. It's ancient wisdom. And then there was this real, piece that I was like, I really want to know what that is. So can you explain for us, for the listeners, like, what is the connection between yoga and prosperity? We touched on it a little bit at the beginning about union and these beautiful 4 universal goals, but I'd love to dive deeper into that real connection between the two.
Well, the most fundamental connection is, the way that yoga supports us in being able to access our own inner resources and our deepest wisdom, through all the practices that are available to us with yoga, but principally meditation. I'm a teacher of meditation, and, through our meditation practice, we learn how to get, beyond the mind, beyond the restless mind and its doubts and fears and worries. And, we learn how to be anchored in our essence of being, our spiritual essence, which is the true source of our wealth. And so, just fundamentally, it's there in the system of yoga to teach us how to know the truth of what we are, that we're not confined to the body or the mind, that we are the soul, the self, the spirit that brings life to the body and lights up the mind. And so that's the foundation, that the essence of a prosperous life, an abundant life, is knowing the truth of what we are. And then we find specific teachings in yoga philosophy about how really they come down to how to change our mind, how to change our thinking, from lack to abundance, and then how that affects our ability to attract the resources that we need to do what we're here to do.
And you speak in the book as well about, and I think it was kama that you said was pleasure, right? Mm-hmm. As one of the universal. And you talk a lot about spiritual striving and how that sometimes can squash that. And I really resonated with that, because when we're, I guess, trying to reach this spiritual ideal, whatever it is that we think that is, we can neglect prosperity for sure as part of that model, but also our own pleasure and joy, because we get way too serious about spirituality. So if you could share a little bit about that and your philosophy around that, that would be great.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Giovanna, that, one of the traps that we can fall into, and I think, so many of us do, and certainly I did, is when we come upon the spiritual path, we're so excited about it. I was. And so I had this idea, wow, I want to be spiritual. I want to be a spiritual person, right? And so we start having that mindset. But according to the teachings of yoga, it's completely backwards, that are the spiritual teachings, the spiritual practices that we engage in are not to become spiritual. That's the fundamental error that actually yoga points to. That's the great mistake that we all make, is somehow thinking that we're going to try to be spiritual. So we do things with that mindset. But the more we do things with that mindset, the farther we get from our awareness of our essential nature, because the truth is we are already spiritual. And even yoga goes so far to say that at the core of our being, we're actually already enlightened. So we don't do these spiritual practices in order to become spiritual or even to become enlightened. So then that raises the question, well, why do it?
Exactly.
Well, we do it because it's the way that a spiritually conscious person lives. We do it so that we can be in touch with the truth of our being, but not to try to create any kind of spiritual condition. So knowing that truth that we are spiritual beings is so liberating. And, as you were pointing to, it makes life enjoyable. We can make ourselves miserable with spiritual practice,
Absolutely. The whole point of life and being of spirit is, I think, to feel and find joy in your existence. Pleasure.
Yeah. And what I'm covering in my book is that these all have to do with essential spiritual teachings and principles. So, for example, the life goal, to enjoy life, has its root in the teaching that the nature of the self, the nature of the soul, is ananda, or bliss. And Joseph Campbell, the mythologist, said, follow your bliss. He wasn't talking about, he wasn't talking about pasta, and I know that could be blissful, but he was pointing to the nature of the soul itself. So following our bliss is learning how to be connected to the innate joy of the soul itself. And so this goal of life, to enjoy life, to experience pleasure, is really at its deep root, pointing us to the very nature of the soul itself. And if we don't enjoy our life, we can't find a way, to find joy in life, we are actually missing our connection to our own soul.
Beautifully said. You reminded me of one of the most powerful asanas or yoga postures I've ever been taught was to turn up the corners of my mouth. Because we take ourselves way too seriously, and often even in spiritual circles, those of us that are seekers, we take it too seriously, and we forget that there's all these beautiful essential parts of us, including joy and pleasure, that are part of us being fully realized here.
And this morning I was thinking about, just connecting with you and about your program and how you support women. And I was thinking about when I was a teenager, I don't know, maybe when I was turning 16 or something like that. I remember my father gave me a birthday card, and I still can see it, in my mind. It was just the sweetest thing that he did. And it was a card that had a quote from Rosalind Russell. And on the card was a quote from her that said, "Joy in living is a woman's best cosmetic."
Oh, I love that.
I know, and and have it come from my father. And of course, at the time, I didn't, I thought it was a lovely card. But, I was kind of a moody teen, so he was probably trying to help me turn that around. But, I didn't know really until I found the spiritual path. I didn't know how to find joy in my life. And that was a problem. And it actually brought me to the spiritual path, which is so common for people. The number one way we come to the spiritual path is suffering. And for me, it was that, inability to connect with my own self, with my own joy.
Yeah, what a powerful gift to receive, and a powerful message even for the listeners. I say this a lot, mostly in private with my clients, but of course I've talked about it on this show, is, a woman or a man, anyone, a being that is in their full radiance is the most attractive force out there. Yeah, I just absolutely adore that. I had a question for you around this, and I'm in particular, for selfish reasons, as a lot of things are on this show, I'm writing an article right now around the concept of surrender versus submission, and this idea of spiritual surrender. And that's been such a huge part of my journey and my healing, really. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about surrender and how that actually relates to true prosperity.
It's really essential, for the ultimate thriving. I mean, there's a lot that we can do, from self-will. There's a lot that we can create. We're really powerful beings, but ultimately self-will has its limits, and we just hit a wall, we just get tired. But surrender is the opposite. It is letting go. And I like to think of it as letting go into support. So sometimes, people think of surrender as resignation, as letting go in defeat. But surrender, spiritual surrender, is really letting go of the illusion of the erroneous thought that we're somehow separate from the source. And so when you think about prospering and the fullness of prospering, you can think of surrender as opening to a greater possibility. Now, there's often work that has to be done around that because, and it's really good work, because people don't want to surrender to the divine because they have some old ideas about maybe what the divine would have in mind for them,
Yes, that sounds very familiar.
And I remember, kind of being scared about that. I thought, I'm not sure if, what God wants is what I want, right? But that's an old error thought. And I talk about this in the book. It's kind of like, the wave saying, well, what if the, ocean wants is not what I want? We are expressions of the divine. We are, God's expression in the world. So, what that divine reality wants is what we want, in our heart of hearts, and we understand that we're not separate from that. So that's really at the heart of the practice of surrender is letting go of the idea that we're actually on our own.
It makes me think of a quote that I adore. Two of them, really. One is, from Oprah, that she said, God or spirit has a bigger plan for you than even you can imagine. Mm-hmm. So that puts us in the place of alignment where, I love the analogy or the metaphor you used about the wave in the ocean. And the other big piece of that for me and takeaway is a reminder of, one of the foundational principle of A Course in Miracles, which is a universal principle that you just paraphrased, which is, we think we have many problems, but we really only have one, and that is the belief in our separation from God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's beautifully said.
Yeah.
It's beautifully said. And life, as Paramahansa Yogananda, who is in my lineage and my tradition, said, this side of the transcendental field, life is ever new joy. And so, with spiritual surrender, we can experience life, I think, more as a great adventure. And one of the things I have become aware of is that when we're experiencing life as a burden, that's an indication that it's time to let go, of that way of holding our life. So I kind of call that the back door into surrender, because people often don't know well, how do I surrender? How do I do it? And you can't really do surrender. It's because it's allowing, it's letting go. So I just say, well, if this part of your life feels like a burden, if your life is a burden, imagine what it would be like to let that go. What would it be like to let that go? And that's a surrender practice.
So much wisdom. Thank you so much for being on this show. I can't believe we're already just over 30 minutes. For everyone listening, please go and get this book. Again, it's called The Jewel of Abundance, Finding Prosperity Through the Ancient Wisdom of Yoga, and you can get it on Amazon. Ellen, I am just forever grateful for this conversation. I feel even more enlightened just having had this beautiful wisdom coming from you. Thank you so much for your time and for the work that you do and for being on the show.
Well, thank you, Giovanna. It's really been a delight, and I really appreciate your spirit, your energy, and your living your dharma and supporting people the way that you do in the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for tuning in, and keep rising, everyone. For books and resources related to today's episode, make sure you head over to sherisespodcast.com, and I'll see you there. If you've enjoyed today's episode, make sure you tune back in next week when I dive into more juicy topics to help make your life the best it can be. And hey, if you've enjoyed listening to the show and you love it, head on over to iTunes and leave me a rate and review and subscribe there to the show.